Can I ask all members of the public jury to take your seats and the witnesses and advocates to join us in the court? Welcome, comrades, to today's public hearing of the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes, the final session out of 3. My name is Jonas Staal, and in my role as clerk, I declare this court in session. The case listed for today's hearing is Trading with People's Lives, the East India Company, the British Crown, and the violent severance of land-people relations. This court is presided by Comrade Rada de Souza and Comrade Judges Sharon H. Venn and Ramon Vera Herrera.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the third and last session of this court. The case we will be hearing today is the British East India Company and the British Crown and the forced separation of land-people relations. So that is what we will focus on. The East India Company was established in December 1600 under a royal charter given by Queen Elizabeth I. And it was wound up in 1858 by the British Crown. The question for us today is, whatever happened between 1600 and 1858, why should we worry about it today? Is it true that the systems of governance that the East India Company and the British Crown jointly established during that period has continued to expand and flourish? These are some of the questions that we will be addressing today, and the witnesses will speak to you about why we should or should not pay attention to this history. I want to draw your attention to two documents that I encourage you to familiarize yourself with. The first is the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act, and you should find this on page 21 of your program booklet. This special court is established under statutes of the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes 2025. You will find these statutes on page 29 in your program booklet. These two statutes, the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act and the statutes of the Special Court, is the law that will be applied to these hearings today. We must inform you that you are here as members of the jury. In that role, you are a participant in the work of this court. You are not an observer, you are not a visitor. We ask that you pay careful attention to what the witnesses say and make your decision on the basis of evidence presented to this court. This is a special court in more than one sense. In this court, you are here as ancestors of future generations. You are not here to represent personal interests. You are not here to represent the interests of your communities or your states, but rather you are here to represent all life forms, all beings, human and non-human. We invite you to reflect on those relationships and the interdependent relationships that must exist between people and between communities and between all other forms of life if life on this planet is to continue. The law that you will follow, as I have already said, when you make your decision at the end of these hearings today, is the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021. You will not bring into this court any preconceived ideas about climate crimes or justice or legal proceedings. Section 2 and 3 of the Act provide the definitions and aims of this court. Please refer to those sections when you evaluate the evidence that you are about to hear. In this court, you are here, I said, as members of the jury. You are also in the presence of other comrades whose lives or the lives of whose ancestors was profoundly impacted by the activities of the East India Company and the British Crown. You will see in front of you Comrade Indigo, which was one of the commodities that was captured and traded and commodified by the East India Company and the Crown. You will see before you cotton, jute, sugarcane, opium, and all the comrades in this room that you see are also witnesses, as well as they are present here in the hearing as affected communities. The special court is required to bring focus and attention to intergenerational aspects of climate crimes. All lives have value, whatever their forms. So in this court, we do not privilege human lives over non-human lives or vice versa. Please keep that in mind when you make your decision. Section 4 of the Special Court Statute sets the tasks for us today, the judges as well as the jury. Our task will be to determine whether or not the relationships of states and corporations are by design set up to perpetuate crimes against ecologies and communities. Therefore, our task today is to pay careful attention to the relationship of states and corporations as legal artifacts and their institutional design. If the purpose of social institutions are to facilitate reproduction of the conditions necessary for life, if the Act of 2021 aims to build relationships of solidarity between people and other forms of life, are the relationships that, as they exist between corporations and state, fit for purpose? That will be the question that you will weigh in on. You will hear from witnesses today. The first witness will testify to the East India Company and their actions and the systems that they established together with the British Crown. The second witness will testify to the systems that corporations and states follow today. And the last testimony will be from an advocate for this court who will assist us in making connections between the past and the present and their continuities and changes that have occurred over this period of time. After each witness has presented their testimony, you will have an opportunity to put questions to them. Please be very brief with your questions, and that will give an opportunity to many more of you to ask questions. So I will now ask Comrade Stahl to call out the first witness.
I call upon the first witness, Comrade Sudipto Mitra, an Indian historian teaching in Mizoram, whose research focuses on indentured labor systems in the 19th century. Comrade Mitra, you have 20 minutes for your testimony, and in the final minute, you will hear a bell.
Thank you. Right. So the indentured labor system was popularized in the British Empire or across the British Empire following the abolition of slavery. It began in earnest in 1834 with the transportation of 36 men of the quote-unquote Dhangar caste from the port of Calcutta to Mauritius. Over the course of the 19th century, it spread to the British colonies of Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Fiji, and South Africa. The French colonies of Guadeloupe, French Guyana, Reunion, and Martinique. And, along with all these colonies, the Dutch colony of Suriname. Can we have the first slide, please? The one after that. Right. You can see on this map, encircled in blue is India, the Indian subcontinent, British India at that particular point of time. You will find the source of the map here. This is a map from 1883. And circled in red are all the places that I've just now mentioned, the various colonies of the British, French, and Dutch empires. The system emerged as a replacement for slavery. With time, though, it turned into a stable labor regime unto itself and was introduced beyond the Atlantic world in places such as the tea plantations of Assam in northeast India. As a successor to slavery, the indenture system could never quite convincingly come out of its predecessor's overwhelmingly large shadow. Throughout the 19th century and afterward, questions continued to be raised whether it was simply, quote unquote, a new system of slavery. This comparison, though, was most comprehensively and famously laid out by historian Hugh Tinker in his seminal 1974 book called A New System of Slavery. Can we have a look at the next slide, please? Right, here you have a cover of the book. The points of Tinker's comparison were, and I list them one by one, the deceitful recruitment of laborers, their confinement in depots and plantations, the absence of any meaningful legal assistance to the laborers, the power relations of debt imposed upon them by their plantation owners, and the curtailment of laborers' rights to collective action. Defendants of the indenture system and some historians such as Kenneth Gillian, who greeted Hugh Tinker's book with a very hostile review, nevertheless countered these comparisons. While Gillian drew counter comparisons between aspects such as the mortality rates on slave ships and indenture ships to show an improvement from slavery to indenture, the former lot, as in the defendants of the indenture system back in the 19th century, upheld the indenture contract as a defining distinction between the two systems. They argued that it marked the departure from one to the other. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Right, here you see a copy of the contract that was used to recruit the indentured laborers. The contract, it was argued, laid out the terms and conditions of work to a laborer. It was supposed to give him, quote unquote, personhood, as Ulbe Bosma calls it, and protect him from trafficking and exploitation. Moreover, as Jeremy Bentham had observed, the quote unquote property that was transacted through this particular labor contract was labor itself and not the laborer. The contract also was seen as providing a site of negotiation for the laborer where he could negotiate the terms and value of his work with his employer. But this hardly proved to be the case. Laborers, more often than not, found it difficult to comprehend their contracts. And once they were subjected to various kinds of oppression on the plantations, the contract, as Ulbe Bosma again points out, quote unquote, severely limited their scope for collective action. Can we please move on to the next slide? Right, here you see a Bengali translation of the same indenture contract that we saw in the previous slide, just to give you a sense of how these contracts were translated. Thus, instead of deriving security, laborers ended up becoming prisoners to their own contracts in various ways. For example, if a laborer had been subjected to physical violence from a planter, he would still have to continue working for the planter until he was able to prove that the planter had indeed beaten him. But proving this was next to impossible within the given administrative structure, and if the laborer was to run away from work to find recourse, he would be charged for desertion. Such incidents were especially common in the tea plantations of Assam, where even flogging was used as a way of disciplining laborers. The case of Busan, probably the actual name was Bhushan, Narsaya, a Madrasi coolie who was flogged at the Victoria Tea Company's Yangpur plantation in Hailakandi, Kachar in Assam, can be considered an example in this regard. 6 years later, in 1887, a Bengali periodical called Poridarshok, which roughly translates to observer, also reported a similar case in Shibsagar in Assam, where a young coolie boy was flogged to death by a planter called Mr. Geddes. In overseas indenture too, such acts were not uncommon. On the ship Shah Alam, for example, which traveled from Calcutta to Mauritius in 1860, coolies were mercilessly whipped by European crewmen for wanting rice when there was actually a shortage of stock of rice. The captain of the ship even caned a woman laborer on board for not maintaining proper hygiene. And after much hue and cry, the captain had to pay a princely sum of just £2 as a fine. The story of Indian indentured labor in the British, French, and Dutch colonies has been researched by many before and after Hugh Tinker. The story of indenture in Assam, on the contrary, in northeast India, is less well known. Nevertheless, the Assam story too is complex and contested. Can we have a look at the next slides, please? So here we see a few, so this is a notice of work. It's aimed at people who are interested to go to Guyana as indentured laborers. Could you move on to the next slide, please? And here you see the Hindustani and the Urdu translation of the same notice. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Right. Just to give you an idea of where Assam is. Going by conventional wisdom, the plant is said to have been discovered, quote unquote, discovered, by a man called Charles Alexander Bruce, a commander of gunboats in Upper Assam around the 1830s. The same person is also credited with the conversion of the plant into a commercially profitable commodity. But the tea plant had been growing in Northeast India since time unknown. Moreover, it was Robert Bruce, C.A. Bruce's brother, who had first seen the plant after he arrived in Assam as a trader in 1823. Robert Bruce had met the chief of the local Singpho tribe, a man called Bisa Guam, during his travels. It is in all likelihood through this connection that Bruce learnt about the consumption of tea by the Singphos. And the Singphos, by the way, inhabit the state of Arunachal Pradesh in today's India. But even before Robert Bruce, Sir Joseph Banks had reported the tea plant's existence in India around 1788. After him, botanist Colonel Robert Kidd and a certain Dr. Gorham had also seen the plant grow in India, as H.A. Antrobus reported in his book. Later on, in 1835, Lieutenant Andrew Carleton of the Assam Light Infantry at Sadia, a man who took great interest in the flora of India, reported to Captain Jenkins, the Governor General in Northeast at that time, that the Kamptis, another tribe, quote unquote tribe, were in the habit of drinking an infusion of the leaves of the tea plant. Jenkins passed on this information to the Tea Committee in Calcutta that was formed in 1834 to experimentally grow tea in Assam. The colonization of Assam went ahead quickly after this. The government experimental tea gardens were set up in 1836, and in the following year, in December 1837, Assam tea was successfully manufactured for the first time. Following this, the Assam Company, which was the first joint stock company of India, was founded in London in 1839. To quote Amulendu Guho, the historian who's an authority on this, it remained virtually the sole planter in the field till about 1850. It owned huge swathes of land in the province. On paper, the East India Company's intention was limited to just experimenting with the tea plant and to check whether it would survive the Indian climate. In other words, it did not openly speak about establishing a monopoly over the Indian tea trade, just like it did with the Chinese opium trade. But then there were overlaps in people who held office with the East India Company and those who were involved in the Assam Tea Company. One such case in point was a man called Peter Auber. He had served as secretary to the East India Company and then worked with a man called Walter Prideaux, the secretary of the Assam Tea Company, to draft various settlements for the Assam Company. Moreover, it was the East India Company's charter of 1833 that gave Europeans the power to own lands outside the presidency towns of, and you can see in your maps here, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, on long-term leases without rights. Then, in 1840, within a year of the establishment of the Assam Company, the East India Company transferred them 2/3 of the government's experimental gardens rent-free for the initial years. The wasteland rules were already put in place in 1838, and this is a very specific kind of rules that only applied to Assam at that particular point of time. The wasteland rules were already put in place in 1838 to facilitate this. By virtue of these rules, wastelands, which included forest land, could be leased out to applicants for a period of 45 years with the condition that a quarter of the area must be cleared within 5 years. This clearing of an area essentially meant deforestation. It was a prerequisite for setting up the tea plantations, the clearing of forests, for which land had to be robbed from the forests. The wasteland rules encouraged several European planters to apply for land grants, ranging from 1,000 to 1,500 acres. By 1861-62, the Bengal government, under the East India Company, had acceded to 115 of these applications, and by 1867-68, by now power has shifted to the Crown, to around 418 more. In other words, during the East India Company's tenure and afterwards, the Bengal government alienated vast tracts of land, much more than what was actually required for the cultivation of tea. The annual report of 1878 establishes this. By that year, between 3 lakh, as in 300,000 to 400,000 acres of land were under the control of the planters in Assam, on which land nothing was planted. The existing trees on these lands, though, were not spared. They were cut down for wood, which would be used as fuel for firing and drying tea in large burners within the plantations. Their wood would also be used in the preparation of boxes in which tea would be packed and sent off. In addition, there were also the usual uses of wood, such as in the making of railway lines, construction, et al. Also, around the 1850s, the sal woodcutters, sal is a kind of wood, woodcutters made their way into Assam. Sal wood was valuable for making windows and doors. And once the timber merchants had exhausted their resources in the lower Brahmaputra region, they came up to Kamrup. So, lower Brahmaputra region would be somewhere here, and Kamrup would be somewhere slightly upstairs here. Basically, from the left of the screen to slightly right. Overall, in the words of historian Rajiv Handik, wherever markets for tea were strong enough to enable expansion of plantation acreage, forest cover correspondingly got reduced. In terms of labor, tea in Assam was cultivated mainly by Chinese migrants up to 1843. The British planters trusted that they had a long familiarity with the plant, and therefore they understood its needs and necessities better than anyone else, the Chinese, that is. From 1843 to about 1859, the local people of Assam proved to be a major source of labor, with a substantial number of recruits coming from the Kachari tribe of the Darang district. Recruits from elsewhere, especially Bengal and Bihar of that particular time, were also present in numbers. Among them, the quote-unquote hill coolies, or tribals of Chotanagpur, were in particularly high demand. The reason for this was a prevalent perception that the hill coolies of Chotanagpur were adept at clearing forests. Why was this perception prevalent? Because these people lived in the forests. Thus, one Mr. Campbell of Midnapur was appointed in June 1839 to venture into Chotanagpur, or Bhagalpur in particular, to recruit laborers for Assam. He was recruited in 1839 June, and within just 6 months, 7 more of his colleagues were sent out to the districts of Chittagong, Hazaribagh, Dhaka, Rangpur, Moymonsingo, etc., for the same purpose. Among the recruits that went to Assam and indeed Mauritius, Fiji, South Africa, and the Caribbean, and all the other plantation colonies, a large number were also women. In Assam, particularly, tea picking was mostly done by women. The planters believed that women had very delicate fingers, and with them they could pick the two tenderest leaves and the bud of the tea plant with great care and accuracy. Children, with their tiny fingers, were also used to pick out small insects from within the tea plant. Now, to wrap it all up, indentured labor migration, both to Assam and overseas, has traditionally been understood through the dialectic of push and pull factors. Could we please move on to the next slide? Right. Here you see American sociologist Everett S. Lee's diagram, and you have two circles, the circle of origin, which is where the potential migrant is based before the migration actually happens, and the destination land, to where the migration is supposed to happen. You see a lot of pluses and minuses, which basically represent, the plus factors and minus factors, the advantages and disadvantages of both the places. The zeros in either circle represent neutral factors, to which a potential migrant's decision-making is supposed to be, not affected. In between, you have these mountains, which represent the intervening obstacles. Now, the classical model that historians had adopted from across the ideological spectrum to understand migration was this push-pull model, that peasants were pushed from one place and then they were pulled to another, and that's how migration essentially happened. And what were the push factors that historians have pointed out thus far? New policies of taxation, agrarian distress, famines, floods, overpopulation, changing land policies, large-scale changes to the subcontinent's economy, and even the mutiny of 1857. All these have been classified as push factors which encouraged migration. Among these, the effects of floods, famines, and earthquakes and other climate calamities was so devastating that they sometimes left people with no choice but to migrate. Now, but even, and they were the economic factors which Brij Lal had pointed out, but even the economic factors were not completely detached from the environmental change that was inflicted by first the East India Company and then by the Crown on the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, we reach two obvious questions, and I will leave you with these two questions, which are, how many of these push factors were actually of the colonial state's own making? And the second question, even though the colonial government officially ended the indentured labor system of migration in 1917, following a massive public outcry, how much of it still lives on in the labor regimes of today, both in India and in the rest of the world? Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions to our first witness by our judges for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Ramon, do you want to have a question, or would you like to answer a quick ask? Okay.
Well, it's very interesting to know some of the history of indentured labor, let's say, and it will be wise to understand more about the actual relations of labor, no? That is, not only all these aspects that are really very important, but the difference between actual slavery and the indentures bondage, let's say, because detailing these issues make us understand better the kind of submission they impose to the coolies or the people that worked in these plantations. No?
So, well, in terms of the actual differences between slavery and indenture, we must keep in mind that the sites where both these systems operated largely overlapped, right? You know, in the same plantations where you had the slaves working for a number of years, in those same plantations were the indentured laborers taken as replacements for the slaves. Now, there's a system that was briefly introduced in between slavery and indenture in the so-called slave colonies. It was known as a system of apprenticeship, and it basically, through this particular system, a contract of apprenticeship was offered to the now manumitted slaves, emancipated slaves, and they were asked to come back to the plantations and work under new kinds of terms and conditions. But they refused, most of them at least. And that sort of gives away, to a certain extent, how satisfied people who were already familiar with plantation life, how satisfied they were with the new developments that were done in these new contracts. The indenture contracts were not entirely different from these contracts either. But of course, there were differences. Hours of work sometimes were laid out. The element of consent came in, and after sometime around the 1840s at least, began the practice of making the indentured laborers appear before a governmental authority who would quiz them and who would essentially ask them whether they were willing to migrate or not. Such a situation certainly did not occur in slavery. In indenture it did, but then the powers that be co-opted this measure and found their ways around it. And they sort of began to circumvent these things. So, of course, slavery and indenture were not two entirely similar systems, but they were not completely different systems either. Thank you.
Sharon, would you want to? Okay. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody who came out on a Sunday afternoon. I was thinking, why would you be inside on a sunny day when it's in London when it's not raining? Anyway, but I'm happy you're here. I was really interested in the England had outlawed slavery in the early 1800s, and then the East India Company was overtaken by the English government, right? But in the slide that you showed us, a couple of them, it says that people were signing these documents based on the immigration law that was in place by the British system, which then gave legitimacy to them to indenture people into a type of slavery, even though they had outlawed it, but they still used the state system to give legitimacy to something that they had previously said they wouldn't do. And this is really, extending the concept of the state working with corporations that were created by the East India Company and then continued on with the indentured people, but gave it the legitimacy under this immigration law that they put in place. I'm just looking at the slide that you identified, that form was produced because of that legislation. So, and that was probably approved by the English. Is that approved by the English Parliament, or how did that get legitimized? Because that's what they're saying, is that they gave the legitimacy of them to do what they were doing through a contract. That's what I'm trying to figure it out. Thank you.
Right. So most of the pictures that I displayed on this particular PowerPoint were from the period after the 1860s. So essentially, the crown was in power at that particular point of time. But you see, talking about corporations and companies, one thing we must remember that even the government or the government and the corporation both has to fill up its coffers. And therefore, after the abolition of slavery in 1834 and after the introduction of indentured labor in the same year, it was briefly suspended. The system was briefly suspended after much hue and cry sometime around 1837-38. So the public sphere essentially got the colonial state, the British Empire, to suspend the system. Not abandon it entirely, but certainly suspend it. But then by 1841, the East India Company, as well as the entire British Empire, they realized that if the system was to be completely discontinued, then they would have to bid farewell to the profits that were coming in from the sugar colonies, right? So as a result, they reintroduced, or they brought back a moderated form of the system in the early 1840s, because they realized that we couldn't do without it. There was a huge labor void. So I think there are corporations like the East India Company, as well as the British Empire, the state at that particular point of time, were certainly bound by one common thread, and that was they both had to fill up their coffers somehow. They could not leave the plantations, such vast areas and such minefields of profit, completely empty for years and decades.
Thank you for your answer. And I have a question for you, which is, you mentioned that in the Assam tea plantations, indentured labor from China was brought into the Assam plantations. And then you mentioned that coolies from Chota Nagpur region were brought into Assam to work on the plantations. And you also told us how laborers were exported from the Indian subcontinent around the world, and you showed us that map. So my question is, to what extent is the use of labor from outside a way of displacing indigenous people from their land and producing a more vulnerable workforce? Because this pattern seems to have continued around the colonies. So if you can just address that. And also, in addition, you mentioned that planters were allowed to purchase land outside presidency towns. Now, can you explain what this presidency town is and the governance structures that existed, just so that we are all very clear on what we are talking about here? Thank you.
Thank you. Would it be possible to go back to the second last slide, please? Yes. Yes. So, about displacing labor from their land. This is modern-day Jharkhand. Back in the day, in the 19th century, a large part of this region was classified as the Chota Nagpur Plateau. Now, if you follow the history of colonialism in India in the late 18th and the early 19th century, you would realize that this particular area was up in arms against the colonial state at a very early point. There are multiple rebellions, uprisings happening in this particular region from about the 1780s and 90s, right up to Birsa Munda's famous Ulgulan, the Santhal rebellion of 1851. Now, one historian, Prathama Banerjee, had argued this in her thesis, which she did at SOAS, that the East India Company at this particular point of time looked at indentured labor and the possibility of displacing people from that particular region, Jharkhand, West Bengal, to Mauritius, Jamaica, Trinidad, etc., as a way of reducing the population of that area and of, therefore, especially moving out the quote-unquote criminal tribes from these regions, and thereby reducing the possibility of further uprisings and rebellions. So the displacement essentially was used as a strategy to counter insurgencies and rebellions. That is the answer to the first question. Secondly, making people from outside settle in these plantation colonies, certainly, if you settle someone from Assam within Assam, it is much more difficult to control him or her. The laborer would be familiar with the geography of that place. And desertion, escaping the plantation to a point where the colonial states or the East India Company's eyes did not reach, would have been much easier for such a person, presumably. For a person from outside, it would take a long time to familiarize himself with the geography of that region. And Assam and northeastern India, as I've already mentioned, this entire part is a very hilly region. So it's not the plain land that you find very difficult, very easy to navigate and access. So of course, introducing aliens, people from outside, to the plantations as workers certainly had its upsides. And finally, the presidency towns. So the presidency towns, the three main presidency towns in 18th, 19th century India were Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, roughly around these areas. Now, these towns were obtained, or these presidencies, so-called, were obtained by the East India Company through charters and farmans. For example, Calcutta was, a part of Calcutta was obtained by the British East India Company, or Jobus Charnock, a man called Job Charnock, for the first time. You all know where Calcutta is, I suppose, somewhere here. By something called the Farrukh Siyar's Farman. And Farrukh Siyar was a later Mughal emperor. And that is how they acquired Calcutta and gradually began to expand their territories from Calcutta, or around Calcutta. Similar sort of trajectory can be found in several other places. But these three areas were mainly the places where the East India Company stationed their armies. You had the Madras Regiment, the Bengal Regiment, and the Bombay Regiment. And that is that's basically, in a nutshell, the importance of these presidency towns. Assam was explored or sort of found out by the East India Company, the Northeast entirely, somewhat during the Anglo-Burmese Wars, when the British came in conflict with the Burmese around this region. And they had to navigate this region from Calcutta through the northeast of India. You see? And that is when they actually came into Assam. And we've just read about Robert Bruce, who was commander of gunboats. And basically, these are all military personnel who venture into these tracts, to take preparations for the Anglo-Burmese War and to support the war effort. And that is how they come into contact with northeastern India. And then by virtue of the charter, they actually begin to exert their rights on the land in these parts. And then through tea comes in the Assam Company and gradually begin for the first time to develop land holdings around this region.
We now move to the questions of you, members of the public jury, to our first witness. Please limit your questions to 1 minute. Raise your hand if you have a question, and presiding judge Rada de Souza will call out the questions.
Yes. Yeah. Frame your question, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So I wanted to perhaps continue from where we just left off with Judge D'Souza's question about the ability of indentured workers to orient themselves in the lands, but also the way of Assam, but the ways that the movement of people from their locale to a new geography is a strategy of dispossessing indigenous people from their land. I think it would be worthwhile to go deeper into it. I'm familiar with stories of marriage across the colonized world. So when people who are enslaved essentially refuse the conditions of their enslavement and self-emancipate. And there are stories of people fleeing, right, enslavement from the first moment that they land in a colony. Sometimes it takes weeks, months, years. But there are all of these stories as well amid, the horrors of marooning enslaved people and indigenous people forming communities and networks of solidarity and resistance. This is often taking place in these mountainous geographies. So as you spoke of Assam, I wondered whether there were similar experiences that were also emerging. As we go deep into the conditions of bondage, what are the possibilities of solidarity and collective emancipation that also emerged from indentured people coming into recognition of their bondage, right? Coming into recognition of their role in displacing people from that geography? What modes of solidarity and resistance were formed through that shared experience of those conditions?
Thank you so much for that lovely question. You see, that is always there. And, the past comes to us in traces. We find traces of the past from the archives, from various kinds of historical sources, and then we basically try to knit them together like a garland. The point is, these solidarities of people who are sort of simultaneously basically oppressed by the same structures, sort of brothers in servitude to a certain extent, we find them coming together whenever there is a case of flogging, there's a case of a planter kicking a pregnant lady to death, as was done with an indentured laborer called Shukurmuni in one of the plantations in Assam. We find the laborers joining hands, coming together, and rising up in revolt, organizing strikes, and protesting in the ways that they can. But of course, the contract and the laws are completely held against them in such circumstances, because the onus of proving that they have been oppressed or they have been violated lies on the laborers themselves. Now, of course, this is resulting in a variety of changes, legal changes, and even the nature and form of the contract that we just saw, that is also changing. So you see, the contract that an indentured laborer had to sign in 1834 was not exactly the same contract that an indentured laborer signed in, let's say, 1890, right? So these small changes can be looked upon as victories of the laborers themselves, the sheer force of their collectivization. But then they find, or their voice becomes more emboldened once the proliferation of print takes place in the colonial world, and more vernacular newspapers start coming out, not only in the cities, but also in the mofusils and in the villages, right? That is how information is flowing. And many of the Brahmo Samajis, for example, and the periodicals, they take up these stories and they report them. The incidents from distant, faraway Assam reach Rajasthan, Bombay, several other places, all across the Indian subcontinent, and sometimes to even London. And people express their dissatisfaction. And that is how the anti-indenture movement, or the movement against indenture, is consolidated, as we approach the end of the 19th century. And gradually, joining hands with the First World War, it results in various ways in the eventual abolition of the system in 1917. So certainly these things are there, but we don't see the everyday, union or the everyday coming together of these laborers in these plantations, which might have certainly happened. But there's no way of finding it out because of the limitations of historical sources. But we certainly notice them whenever a wrongdoing happens in one of these plantations. And people come together to protest.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
You. Hello? I wonder how important it is to use certain language where is the word laborer perpetuating a certain kind of condition, and how different is the word laborer from an employee or from just a person, and what sort of system that perpetuates and creates.
It is, certainly it is. But laborer, like indentured laborer, is basically an official terminology. The word indentured is coming from indenture, as in to stamp or indenture a certain contract, and the word laborer is coming from labor. So that is how these, but then of course, words have lives of their own. And that's the beauty of words to a certain extent. They take on meanings, as they live longer and longer. And of course, sometimes they leave behind their own connotations, sometimes they carry them with them and evolve and gain different kinds of meanings. So I think that is the thing with words.
Yes, here.
Hi, thanks. I wonder if you'd just give us an impression of how the land laws and also, people, deserters, who was enforcing these laws and how did that work? Is this the introduction of public or private police forces, the military wings, and so on and so forth? Who is pursuing that force of law, if you like?
Right. So law was enforced by the police, of course, in these provinces. They had their policemen. But the plantation owners had their sort of, own musclemen, own overseers. Imagine a plantation like this. You have the tea, tea is a shrub, as all of you know, growing. It doesn't really grow to a great length, or they are basically cut down before they grow to a great length. Imagine this space as a tea plantation. You have the tea shrub growing up to this height. But let's say in four corners of this particular room, you have tall trees. And on top of those tall trees, let's say 4 tall trees, there will be 4 overseers who would be there to basically oversee the work that these laborers are doing. So they enforce the law. If they couldn't, if the workers unionized and began to disobey these people, there were certainly the musclemen. And then after that, there was the police. And the other problem that we must keep in mind with desertion in a place like Assam is that, you see, so huge swathes of forest land are being cleared in Assam to make way for the tea plantations, right? And that essentially is making a number of animals homeless. So, and who are the people who are existing or who are living at the borders of these, human habitation and forest land? The indentured laborers in the tea plantations. So as soon as one of the laborers who does not know his way around Assam too well tries to desert, tries to venture out in one of these forests, it is quite possible that he or she might fall prey to a tiger, similar kind of animal. So there was that threat as well. So you see, there's so many things that are sort of at odds, that are sort of working against the indentured laborer in his quest to escape, to free himself from the shackles of the system.
Thank you. I was just wondering, from what you were just talking about, the deforestation, how much of Assam was deforested during that period?
I, I mean, you know, we have a, I've just given you a set of numbers pertaining to, and I'm not very good with numbers, I'm sorry, but you see, like 3 lakh to 4 acres of land by 1878 were already under the planters' control. So essentially, much of these land had to be cleared, because if you had forests in them, you could not make them profitable. Right? And also, unless you clear the forest, you obviously have the possibility of the wild animals who inhabit the forest coming back. So you had to fence these lands and you had to clear the trees that were there, right? In order to grow, whatever, to do whatever you wanted to do with the land. So that is very much there, but I'm afraid it is very difficult to put it in numbers as to, 60% of Assam forest land was completely cleared by this particular year, and 75% was cleared by this particular year. Sorry, I can't give you numbers, that's all I'm trying to say.
One here, and that will be the last 2 questions. Keep it brief, please.
I'm wondering, I just want to revisit the point that the comrade over there was saying. I mean, the year of 1834 for people being shipped to the Caribbean, I think it is really important. Do you agree that perhaps, the African village movement in Guyana, for example, in Demerara, they were actively trying to negotiate a living wage for their labor. So would you agree that the planter class, including John Gladstone, the father of Prime Minister, Prime Minister Gladstone, the very first shipment of Indians to Demerara was about denying the agency of Africans, and in Guyana's history is about working one group off of the other. So whether or which the actual experience of indenture is a second slavery, isn't the intention of the planter class to perpetuate that? The second thing, really quickly, I'd like you to answer the second question you posed is, are there forms of bonded labor on the tea plantations of India today? Thank you.
I agree with your first proposition, certainly. One can look at it that way. In terms of tea plantations today, the conditions of laborers are not too well off even today, to be honest. There are unions, and if you look at the 19th century, many of these tea plantations were like self-governing entities. The planter was responsible for this, for the health of the coolies. The planter was responsible. They had something called the lower primary schools in these plantations, which still exist, right? The planter was forced to open that. In other words, he was legally bound to operate these institutions. But now they fall under the government, right? And now you have a democracy whereby even these tea plantations and the huge amount of laborers that live in these tea plantations are certainly constituencies. They vote. So you have to think about them. But then again, when you see things like the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, being introduced, and so many of these laborers who were responsible for Assam's economic growth in the 19th century, their names being completely excluded from the NRC, you actually begin to question how much has changed. Whether it is only the labor that these people provide, it's the only thing that's valued about these people. Are they really valued as human beings? Thank you.
So when you say NRC, you mean the National Register of Citizens that was introduced as the citizenship laws? Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the contract and speaking a little bit about the notion of return as well. the notion of return. So the contract, as I understand, in relation to Guyana, for example, is based on a temporary contract. So the question is whether the East India Company was ever really interested or had the intention of returning the laborers back to India they had shipped.
The onus of returning the laborers back to India did not fall on the East India Company technically, but it fell on the planters who were taking them from India to abroad, right? They had to pay for a quote unquote return passage of these laborers from the plantation colonies abroad to India. Now, of course, even the laborers tried to circumvent this. And, moreover, in cases of places such as the West Indies, which is very far away from India. From Mauritius to India is, it's reasonably a shorter distance. But from West Indies to India, you have to travel, a long way. And inevitably, for planters, they would incur, more money, they would incur more expenses to send the laborers home from the West Indies. So they tried their best to make them settle there. And also, we must remember, and this is one of the reasons why women indentured laborers were introduced in these colonies. The planters signed up for indentured labor with the hope that bringing so many people from India, from South Asia, from other colonies, the Chinese, to the plantation colonies would eventually help in making these plantation colonies self-sustainable in terms of labor. So the labor, that's why you needed women, and you would have their children who would again be re-employed in these plantations as laborers, right? So that's how you make the circle go on and on. And of course, many returned, many did not return. But and this is when a system called Sardari recruitment also emerged out of this, that sometimes when these planters, they had no choice, but they were obliged, they had to send the laborers back to India, they made sure that the laborers recruited more laborers for them, right? So you're paying the return passage, which you're anyway about to pay, but then in exchange of that, you're getting some work out of the laborer and using him as your envoy, as your recruiter in the laborer's native village, right? So that's how you're trying to maximize profits.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Sousa, questioning has ended.
Call out the second witness, please.
I call upon the second witness, Comrade Mostafa Henaway, who is an Egyptian Canadian writer, researcher, community organizer, works with the Immigrant Worker Center, the IWC in Montreal, to support immigrant and migrant workers, also the author of Essential Work, Disposable Workers, Migration, Capitalism and Class. Comrade Henaway, you have 20 minutes for your testimony, and in the final minute you will hear a bell.
Thank you. Thank you, clerk. Thank you to the judges, and thank you to the jury. Today, my testimony is to examine not the legacy of indentured labor that was formally abolished by the British in 1917, but in the fact how it's morphed, proliferated, and underpins our global economic system today. That it has not, in fact, receded and be replaced by the notion of free labor or labor mobility, but in fact is central to global capitalism today and always has been in its expansion, as was in the case of the British Empire. In the aftermath of the abolition of indentured labor in the post-war period, we see indentured laborers resurface in the post-war boom, in the reconstruction across Western Europe and the United States. The Windrush generation, which many people might be familiar with, and the UK, which brought 500,000 migrant workers from the Caribbean, and even an invisible Windrush generation of indentured laborers from India who were living in the Caribbean as well, were part of this Windrush generation who faced legal discrimination in terms of housing, in terms of their rights, denial to citizenship, and are still receiving compensation to this day for the structural abuses faced by these migrant workers. In fact, they rebuilt London. They worked in the NHS, the London Underground, but they were structurally invisible. Or the Gastarbeiter program in West Germany, which brought in hundreds of thousands of Turkish migrant workers in the post-war construction. They too were invisible, were deemed to be temporary, but were at the heart of West Germany's reindustrialization. When these Gastarbeiters took it to themselves to demand full equality and the same rights as German citizens, as in the case of the 1973 wildcat strike in Cologne, demanding 1 Deutschmark plus an hour, like their German co-workers who had the right to unionize while they didn't, was a turning point in the end of the Gastarbeiter program, but also in terms of migrant worker programs in the advanced industrial capitalist countries. Why? Because the crisis of 1973, the rise of a new right, an extremely racist right, whether it be in the UK, whether it be in West Germany, whether it be in the United States, in the late 70s and 80s, saw the rescinding of many of these migrant worker programs. Also for the capitalist class and for the governments that orchestrated these guest worker programs, they didn't realize or didn't think that these migrants who came from the colonies would demand equality, would demand citizenship, would not want to return back to their homes, but to have equal rights. And as a result, governments across Western Europe and North America began to rethink their labor regimes and how they manage migration. So today, what I want to examine is how that has resurfaced in our moment of globalization, or the globalization of capitalism, and how it's become central to its reproduction and to the reproduction of our societies. And most of that migration comes from the global south. Well, one thing that we have to think about and understand is that global migration from the global south to the global north is not the invasion of hordes that you hear from people like Orban or Trump or politicians in this country. But in fact, the share of the migrant population of the world, of people who move across their borders, remains the same. Nearly 3% of the world's population. While there are nearly 280 million migrants, much of that migration is actually labor migration. According to the International Labor Organization, 167 million out of the 280 million migrants worldwide are economic migrants. These are migrant workers. Well, are they indentured labor or guest workers or temporary foreign workers? There's been much debate, but the significance and scale of migrant labor today, from the global south to the global north, cannot be underestimated. And one way to quantify that is that today, the remittance flows from migrants from the global north to the global south has reached $800 billion. making it the largest flow of capital, more than foreign direct assistance, more than foreign direct investment. It is now the lifeline for the global south, but more a lifeline for global finance and for global capital. And so I want to look at 3 examples to demonstrate how indentured labor has endured and how it's become central and how it is built upon both the exploitation, not just of human labor, but as this court is focused on intergenerational climate crimes, also intertwined and deeply interlinked to the exploitation of land and of nature. And that where we see indentured labor has always been deeply tied to that. And so I look at the kafala system in the Gulf countries, corporation of the Arab Peninsula, and the rise of fossil capitalism. Also, where I come from, the product of British imperialism and colonialism, the settler colony of Canada, and how indentured labor and the dispossession of land went hand in hand. And third, global agribusiness and the way corporations such as Tesco, in order to maintain their profits, have relied on migrant labor throughout their supply chains. So when we think about fossil capitalism and labor migration, the GCC, or the Arab Gulf countries, becomes the most important place to start. The Arab Gulf countries have always had indentured labor. While they were colonies during the British Empire, had also saw extensions of indentured labor. But after independence, they'd replace that labor with migrant workers from large Arab countries such as Egypt, occupied Palestine, Yemen. But obviously, as migrant workers with unequal rights, the denial of citizenship rendered temporary, they had begun to organize under the banners of national liberation and of socialism in the post-war period. These Arab workers began to organize. And as a result, they were deemed dangerous to the monarchies that oversaw them and the burgeoning oil economies of the GCC. After the rise of the petrodollar and fossil capitalism on a global scale, the GCC representing some of the major world reserves, and the thirst of labor in the GCC and its development saw the unprecedented rise of migrant workers, comprising of over 24 million, making them, in this region, the predominant majority. In some countries like Qatar, 88% of the population is non-citizen. While the UAE doesn't provide formal data, it is well over 50%. For Saudi Arabia, 40% of the population is non-citizen. But these migrant workers live under a system of apartheid. The kafala system that was developed is a privatized form of migration where the kafil or sponsor is responsible for the recruitment, the bringing in of labor, but also has full control. If the kafil terminates the contract, then the worker can be deported. There are no rights towards permanent residency, nor the basic rights we take for granted under capitalism. The convention that you may be free to fire me, but I may be free to seek other employment. Under the kafala system, a worker cannot transfer their contract. They cannot leave the employer or they will face automatic deportation, rendering them completely under the control of their kafil, of their employer. And as a result, are treated like commodities. They face debt bondage to recruiters and middlemen in their countries of origin. They face extreme violence as a result. This is one stat that 6,500 migrant workers had died in Qatar since 2011, up until the day that the FIFA World Cup was played in 2022. Building the mega stadiums to host this grand international event to demonstrate that Qatar's government and that Qatar's state was a major global power as a sign of soft power. And the consequences were that 6,500 migrant workers had to die. And the result, because of this debt bondage that was talked about historically, many of these workers cannot flee. They're afraid of violence back home towards their families by recruiters. They're afraid that if they do not continue to remit, to continue to pay back, to continue to pay off their debt, that there will be extreme consequences. So as a result, they accept their vulnerability, they accept their precarity, but not in all cases. Even during the FIFA World Cup, Nepalese workers struck and protested for non-payment of wages, but were ultimately deported. In other cases, the violence is even more extreme. This is Joanna, a Filipina domestic worker in Kuwait, who was also killed by her employers and left in the freezer because her employers felt a sense of impunity that only indentured labor regimes create amongst their employers, knowing that they own their workers like a commodity as a result of this legalized system of violence. So while we look at the kafala system as an extreme form of modern indentured labor, it is not the only one. And if we look to Canada, it has become the model of indentured labor in our times. The emulation of all advanced capitalist states want to emulate our model of the kafala system. And Canada, in its foundation since 1867 by the British North America Act, was based on very two simple things that was brought up by other members of the jury. Land dispossession on a massive scale, a genocide of the indigenous population, and the need for labor for capital, the need for a cheap migrant labor force. And this has been the model of the Canadian state since its foundation. It begins with the advent of the railroads and the land theft and the ability to bring in indentured labor from China, also coolie labor from India, and to its modern form. And before I actually get to the tar sands, its real takeoff is in 1966 with the formation of what's called the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. So the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program brought in migrant labor, mostly from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, to work on the fields and the farms. These workers would come on what's called closed work permits. They could work 6 to 9 months a year, would have to return back to their country. They can only work for one employer. And if they were fired or the contract was terminated, could be deported immediately. They could be blacklisted and not able to return to the farms the next season. This has become the model of Canada's labor migration regime. While it was restricted into agricultural work and domestic labor by Filipina migrant workers working as caregivers and domestic workers, expanded grossly in 2006. So in 2006, the discovery of the tar sands in Alberta, and this is the Athabasca River before and after, turning Canada into a petrostate, similar to the GCC, with a reserve of 164 billion barrels of oil. It was a massive amount of wealth. And the violence as a result, further dispossession of indigenous lands and people, rates of cancer, violence, and wealth extraction for those oil corporations, but the devastation to the environment and to the people, to labor, was inconsequential. So as a result of the oil sands and its rapid expansion, there was a need for migrant labor on an unprecedented scale. Migrant workers had even called it the Gulf of the North. And as a result, Canada had turned this small program of indentured labor into what was then called the Low-Skilled Pilot Project, which brought in over 300,000 workers in 200 different occupations, from gas stations to McDonald's, all similar like the farm worker program, on temporary visas. 1-year contracts, 2-year contracts. And as a result, its expansion had become the centerpiece of Canada's immigration regime. There's more temporary migrants in Canada than there are permanent migrants. This is the borders and the violence that we're seeing in the US today or in Europe is to create a system similar to that of Canada, where permanent migration are those from preferred countries, European countries, highly racialized, while temporary indentured labor for those from the global south. And this is Trump's statement during his first State of the Union address in 2017. And I think we should have a merit-based immigration system like they have in Canada, like they have in Australia. So we have people coming in that have a good track record. And recently, after his tariff announcement, he actually stated, now that we have a real border, one that was demonstrated extreme violence, we need more immigrants. That the far right is never anti-migrant, but it wants migration on its terms. And this is an example of the closed work permit in Canada that shows their rights and the structural differences and apartheid that migrant workers face. And these are two comrades, and I'm going to end it off here. That is Carol Benedict, who was a farm worker, who was sexually abused, working 80 hours a week on a farm, but she had fled. She had claimed refugee status, and she had won, and is now an organizer, a spokesperson for our Immigrant Workers Center. That is Noe Arteaga, who was a farm worker in a tomato greenhouse, and he also faced systemic abuse. He started a sit-down strike, was terminated, and was going to be deported. But he, with the help of the center, fought for his status and continues to fight for migrant workers today. Even the UN Special Rapporteur on modern-day slavery has called Canada's temporary foreign worker program a breeding ground for slavery, modern-day slavery, as a result of the closed work permit system. And quickly, or not very quickly, very, very, very quickly, this is not just in North America. In Western Europe today, global agribusiness, grocers like Tesco rely heavily on migrant labor. This is Almeria, Spain, El Ejido, the largest concentration of greenhouses in Europe, which brings together 100,000 migrant workers. It is the produce basket of all of Europe, responsible for 80% of the tomatoes on the continent, over 50% of the produce. These migrant workers toil for 20 euros a day, working 12 hours a week, supplying Tesco, Sainsbury as well. This is a group of Burmese migrant workers in Thailand who were the victims of debt bondage, of unpayment, and extreme exploitation by a supplier of F&F fashion for Tesco. These are migrant workers in Italy who also work in the supply chains of Tesco, who faced non-payment, who endured 12 to 14-hour workdays producing canned tomatoes that were being sold here in your local Tesco's. That the supply chains internal to Tesco, which concentrates 30% of the food retail market in the UK, show the power that corporations have, and that for them to maintain and to retain their profitability, rely on a disposable migrant labor force. That's model was very much that of the British Empire and the indentured labor regime that it had designed. That is the architecture of our global economy today. And I want to end to really demonstrate this, just a brief thought experiment. Imagine two boats off of the port of Alexandria, Egypt. Both of them will have migrant men. They will be Muslim. They will be Arab. You would assume both of these boats are heading for Southern Europe. It could be Lampedusa. It could be the ports of southern Greece. Both of these boats you would consider would be a threat to Europe in the eyes of the politicians, in the eyes of the AfD, in the eyes of Meloni and the right-wing government in Italy. But in fact, only one of them is considered a threat. Because one of these boats, those migrants are seeking asylum. They're seeking freedom. They're seeking equality. They're seeking citizenship and the rights that we all have. But the other boat is organized by the International Organization of Migration and will bring over those same Egyptian men as temporary workers to work in those tomato fields, the fisheries in Greece, or in the warehouses that fuel the logistics capitalism of northern Italy on guest worker visas. These Muslim migrants are not invaders. In fact, they're welcomed with open arms by the entire European political class because they're the center of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions for our second witnesses by the judges for 10 minutes.
So in the 10 minutes that is given to us, is there anything that you would like to ask?
Thank you very much for your presentation. As you may be aware, I'm from Great Turtle Island, not very far from the picture you showed of the tar sands. And what Canada is doing, and I don't know how people that you work with feel about this, but Canada is using people to come into our territory and to abuse our territory without any recognition that we have rights in that territory. And so I don't see them reaching out to help us, people that migrate into our territory. And they're actually doing the bidding of the colonizers who are in our territory, which I find very difficult to understand. Because if they're coming from someplace that's abusing them, why are they coming into our territory to abuse us? And then want us to wonder, to support them. So I find it very difficult to see, like you see the picture of the tar sands, the way it looked, the cleanness of the land, and then the filth that's been created, and we have to live there because they will not live there. So I see there's a big issue with that, and Canada may be the leader, but Canada is also the leader in using this kind of process to continue a type of colonization, which they use to make sure their hands are clean, but give it off to somebody else to make it dirty. So do you see the situation?
No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, this is part of their always the colonist strategy, right? This is part of, and this is also part of our work, right? And this is part of those discussions. Because I think for a lot of migrant workers, maybe they have an inherent sense of what colonialism or imperialism had done to them, why they're migrating. They don't might have a visceral sense of the situation or the context they're entering in, right? And the solidarity that's actually needed. And while in some ways it might seem contradictory, I think that's the political work of people who have an anti-colonial analysis, a global analysis, a real sense of history, that it wasn't always the case, even locally, right? If you look at the movements of, the Gather Party, for example, in the West Coast in British Columbia that was organizing migrant workers, was very much not about simply improving labor conditions, but was about building an anti-colonial movement for justice back home where they were, and the indigenous peoples who were also the victims of that same violence and of those same forces. And that's our work that is really central. And a part of this, I think, these hearings is to build that analysis, to build that framework. Because when that does happen, and I'll give examples on the territories that I've lived, when there was the land reclamation at Six Nations, and led by the mothers, we were the first people to go. These were taxi drivers, you know, Iranian and Pakistani and Somali refugees, taxi drivers who brought food together to bring to the occupation because they were working in an organization that had a larger sense of history, that had an understanding of colonialism and their place in it, similar to events in Ganawage, but that only happened when there had been people within the migrant justice movement who've been willing to put forward that analysis, that our solidarity with Indigenous struggles for sovereignty is central to our struggles for justice for migrant workers. That the two are not contradictory, but are part of building a better world against those forces, right? Because if there's Indigenous sovereignty in Turtle Island, that's the same forces that are causing the modern day displacement of people from the global south. But those are difficult conversations because people are there simply on individual needs. That I came to work, I have my contract, I paid my recruiter, I paid my, but I don't think it's impossible. But I think you are right, and but it's a central task within the migrant justice movement, and when that does happen, you see beautiful relationships of solidarity flourish. But that's not. It's hard to generalize that as well. I hope that answers the question, Judge.
In this line, because I think we have arrived here in this session a kind of summary of what we've been seeing all these days, no? All these sessions yesterday and today. Because of course, everything summarizes in this situation you are depicting now. Because now the world is a world of migrants, and those migrants are people displaced from their way of life. They are displaced from their life, no? So we are really looking at the core or at the modern core of all these intergenerational climate crimes that transform themselves into crimes against peoples of the world, against the population of the world. And suddenly there's a contradiction that the capitalism wants us to play in a way that is always could eventually can be egotistic or individualistic and not really something more than solidarity, no, something more. So my question finally is that in this situation where we are summarizing all these issues, what kind of windows, let's say, do you see? What kind of actions we need to take to at least begin those kinds of conversations among the people that are trapped in this, let's say, between fate and destiny, to put it in a forced way. No?
I think, for one, the question of migration has become a central question politically, globally today. It brings down states, it brings down parties and governments, and it props up different political forces. One with a clear agenda to further these processes, to deepen these processes, and that not just a clear rejection, but I think across the board to stand in solidarity with migrants, to stand in solidarity with migrant workers, I think is a window to say that we're going to reject not just the racism and the violence, but this is also about a deeper conversation. This is about building a deeper movement that's going to challenge this entire system, right? I know we're putting the law on trial, but I think the discussions, we have to think about putting the system, which is structured by the laws, also on trial, because I think we have reached the point where it is no longer sustainable. We've reached that crisis point, and I think um, more people from the kind of solidarities that are needed that might have existed 25 or 30 years ago in terms of challenging that framework, that entire framework of globalization, of neoliberal globalization, of corporate-led globalization, and what it would do. We have been right in our critiques of what free trade will do, of what the freedom movement of capital will do, what global agribusiness will do, the kinds of dispossession that we will see, and the dispossession of people. But now I think we're in a place, we've become timid. I think that we've become scared to say we don't want to critique these structures because that's what the far right is doing. The far right is bringing down globalization, or this is what Trump is doing. But we should take up that space again, and to say that people don't want to be removed from their lands. People don't want to be removed from their livelihoods and from their communities. It's not just about the freedom of movement, it's also about the freedom to stay. And that's fundamental. That is fundamental. And that's not what's being discussed when we think about migration. That it's the freedom to stay as much as it is the freedom to move.
I will ask you a very brief question, just clarification. And I think the answer can be quite brief for that because we do need to get to questions from the public. You mentioned the kafala system. In this court, we look at the relationship of states and corporations. And you mentioned the GCC. So where is the connection to the corporations?
The connection to the corporations, I mean, while the recruiters are the state enacts the laws, these countries enacts the laws that enable the kafala system. And while it might be the role of the recruiters, at the end of the day, the recruiters serve the major corporations, whether it be the not the Magic Seven, but the whether it be any, whether it be British Petroleum, whether it be Shell, whether it be all of the major oil producers. And then from there, the economies that have spurred in the Gulf countries as a result. So the entire service economy, the entire construction economy in these countries, which have come as a result to serve the fossil fuel economy of the GCC countries. So in a way, where migrant workers are concentrated both directly in the oil industry, but also servicing the oil industry itself. And they control the visas. And they have no caps. No.
That brings us to the questions by members of the public jury. for 10 minutes. Please limit your questions to 1 minute each. Please provide short answers so we can have as many questions as possible. Raise your hand if you have a question, and presiding judge De Souza will call the questions out.
Yeah, at that end.
Hi, Mohammed. Mostafa, that is. Thank you so much for the presentation. So, I have just a point that you've made in in a response around the right to stay, and of course, the transnational migratory patterns we're seeing is also a form of imperialism. But I think the wider question for me is, can we really talk about migration of those of us who live especially in the global south without addressing the fact that a majority of countries in the global south still do not have economic sovereignty, that we were not able to industrialize, we were not able to build a manufacturing base, that at the end of the day, and when you look, for example, at a country like Kenya, where the new labor minister practically spends 99% of his time literally acting as a labor broker for Saudi Arabia and Dubai and Oman and so on and so forth. So I think there's an importance to talk about the fact that we continue to be under economic siege even as we have independence. And as Sivanandan famously said, we are here because they were there, right? Because the colonialists were there and the structures of extraction continue to exist, we have to continue being exploited, not just on our lands, but across the world. So what do we do with that, reconfiguring the world in terms of dismantling the economic structures of oppression and building solidarity in the context of political, economic, and social sovereignties of the people of the global south?
So the question around, so even the architects of what's taken place in the global south, so the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, through structural adjustment programs, through export-led oriented development, which led to the underdevelopment or de-development even of the majority of countries in the global south, to massive debt bondage, realized as a result of remittances, changed the language. Before, they used to use the language of migration and development. Then the G20 picked up on a funny term, migration as development. They just took out the END and replaced it with an S. So now, as a recognition of the failures of neoliberal globalization towards development that we were all promised, that migration as the new strategy towards development. So it's not just being promoted by the global south, by all states as a form of labor export. If we can't export our populations, we'll export our population. If we can't export goods, we'll export our people. And now for the World Bank and IMF, this has emerged as a strategy of development. So now it's being encouraged by the same people and by the same forces that are saying we have too many migrants. And that's why Canada becomes so important, because they want circular migration, quote unquote. They don't want migrants to be permanent, come labor as cheap labor, send the remittances back home, pay off your debts to the World Bank and to the IMF and to the Paris Club with those dollars that you just remitted, so that those dollars go back to Wall Street, to the city of London, remain underdeveloped, and continue to serve us as a cheap source of labor. This is the strategy at the moment. So even for migration, it's only going to further lead to the underdevelopment of the global south. So in a way, there's actually one writer from the OECD who coincidentally said, if the major labor exporters of the world formed something like OPEC, it would be the greatest economic force in the world and would have the most amount of bargaining power over the global north, more than OPEC. So that way of thinking about organizing in the global south from a place of power to no longer export our labor, I think is an interesting avenue to say we're going to break those linkages, right? But that's a massive undertaking. Yeah.
Okay. Just maybe one more question. Yes, the hand there behind.
Could you say something about what happens to the poor and the real working class people of the countries to which the migrants go to?
I mean, there's this idea that it's always this interesting argument that people will migrants will lower wages, migrant workers will lower wages, will take away the jobs of poor working people, and the pandemic serves as this incredible example of what happened. And in terms of the unwillingness of employers to actually pay decent wages and just be decent capitalists, right? When the borders were closed to all, I'll give the Quebec example. I know it was very similar in the UK. No one wanted to do harvest work, despite the incentives. The Quebec government was going to pay people $300 above the wages weekly for people to harvest, right? For people, Quebecois, to work in the fields. Nobody went because nobody wanted to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, live in a labor camp, right? So it's very clear that migrants are concentrated in sectors of the economy that where labor will refuse to accept such conditions, right? Another example is in our healthcare systems. No one wants to be personal support workers because no one wants to work 24 hours a day doing emotionally intensive work, physical work, and caring for our seniors. So of course there's this concentration of migrant labor within that segment. So where you see migrants, there's a concentration for a structural reason, right? And if migrants had the right to organize, and they are organizing, forget the rights, they are organizing, it uplifts the entire working class within those countries, right? Migrant workers in North America were the ones to fight for a living wage, right? In 2015. It was migrant workers who've been organizing in the heart of our gig economy, right? They're the ones who are organizing in the Amazon warehouses, right? Taking on the oligarchs that rule us now. So they're fighting constantly for the whole working class. And that's what I always try to tell people. It is not about lowering the conditions, but when we organize those who are the most invisible and structurally invisibilized, it uplifts all of us. And I think that's a real fundamental point.
Okay, there was one hand at this end. Yeah.
Thank you, comrades. I was hoping you could make more explicit the scale of the tar sands project as an analogy for the situations that are on trial.
I mean, the scale of the tar sands, I mean, has turned Canada into the 5th largest oil producer in the world, right? Most of that goes to the United States, and evidently there's now, because there's been major resistance to the pipelines, all of that indigenous led, has stopped a lot of that movement of the oil east-west, right? So to Europe and to Asia. And now you have also the struggle around the Keystone Pipeline as well. I mean, so the scale is massive, right? It is on a similar scale in terms of the level of fossil capitalism in terms of Venezuela or the GCC. It is a major oil reserve, and sort of the land scale. I mean, is also it fluctuates because getting tar sands, getting oil out of the tar sands is very costly, very expensive, very water intensive process. So it's actually quite dirty. It's quite and costly. So only when the price is high, well then these major producers say, well, let's kickstart everything again. But it changed the way our migration regime from that of one of permanent migration to that of temporary migration. So in Canada now, you have over 1 million temporary migrants, and you only have the acceptance of, let's say, 500,000 permanent migrants. And that's not all directly to the economy in Alberta and the tar sands, but it was the path that was taken on as a result of the oil sands. So on the scale both of migration, the scale in terms of displacement, and the shift and the entrenchment of Canada being sort of a resource-based economy based on land disposition was really just crystallized as a result of the tar sands.
This ends questioning.
We will now call upon our advocate for the court, who is who is not with us physically, but who will be presenting remotely and helping us to connect the two witnesses and the time periods that they have talked about. Our advocate for the court is Hashim bin Rashid, who was supposed to be here with us today in person, like in the other cases, but who is unable to travel because of the travel ban that is widely expected to be put in place by the Trump administration in the US. He was supposed to travel from Philadelphia, and there are reports, and universities in the US have issued advisories to their employees not to travel if these are advisories to staff who are not citizens of the US. And it is still widely expected that Pakistan, his home country, will be one of the countries on the banned list. So he's extremely disappointed that he's not able to be here in person, but he will speak to us remotely, and we'll try to support him and include him in these hearings at this time when many of us are facing similar situations. Thank you.
I now call upon the advocate, Comrade Hashim bin Rashid, who teaches in Pennsylvania University. He works with rural communities in Pakistan, including via Campesina and various trade unions. The first part of Comrade bin Rashid's testimony, you will hear him speaking live to you only in voice. For the questioning part with the presiding judges and the public jury, you will see him on screen. Comrade bin Rashid, you have 25 minutes for your expert evidence, and in the final minutes, you will hear a bell.
Honorable judges of the Court of Intergenerational Climate Crimes and public jury, I am sorry to not be able to join you all in person today. It is perhaps no surprise that as we speak about this complex regime of mobility and immobility for global labor, to be advised not to travel due to the climate of fear, both at and inside the borders of America. Rather than a zone for law, the border has always been a lawless zone for migrants, where the biggest fear is not legal violence, but rather random violence, the fear of not knowing what might happen at a border crossing. Many of the more privileged migrants are also affected by this expanding hostility to the beating heart of global capitalism, which is labor. Today, we are gathered to consider the crimes of the British East India Company against labor and nature together. I am left with the task of bringing together the previous testimonies by Mostafa and Sudipto to synthesize key elements of the case against the East India Company on its legacy of indentured and enslaved labor and how it shapes global dynamics of labor and nature exploitation today. The story I will tell is of 4 labor regimes that implicate the East India Company in intergenerational climate crimes. This starts with the labor regime of slavery, moving to indenture, moving to the post World War II period, and then the contemporary neoliberal period. Archival records show that since at least 1680, the East India Company began the transportation of slaves from South Asia and Africa to the Caribbean. Justifications presented for slavery back then echo environmental themes. Famine, natural disasters, economic distress, all caused by colonialism itself, were justified as reasons to forcibly transport the peoples of Asia and Africa as slaves. Today's global climate migrations are similarly products of the pillaging of our soils, our waters, our air, and atmosphere by colonial capitalism. These are the consequences of how the East India Company forcibly broke the human relationship with nature, which was documented so well in yesterday's hearings on global agriculture and militarism. I will present before you the story of how the East India Company reshaped global labor relations through showcasing 4 labor regimes since the 17th century. It should be clear that these regimes never clearly replace each other, but rather operate in the form of a palimpsest, a new script written on top of the same manuscript. And you will see with the sort of images of ships that keep changing across the regimes that many of the modes in which labor travels continue to remain the same. This means that slavery itself never disappears, but that new forms continue to emerge. And it is slavery is morphing into indenture that constitutes the very form that shapes current global labor regimes. Writing about factory labor, the factory labor regime of 18th century Europe compared to the slave labor regime of the colonies, Marx argued that the two were directly related, saying the veiled slavery of wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. Indenture as a global regime was built on so-called voluntary transportation combined with elaborate systems of coercive contracts, stage managed by corporation states and the mediating form of the labor contract. Indenture mainly gave legal protections through pretending that global labor makes a voluntary choice to destroy their own bodies. The labor contract is even more elaborate now, mediated through expansive penalty systems, which include confiscation of passports, deportation, and violence. Marx noted that in 1790 there were in the English West Indies 10 slaves to 1 free man, in the French 14 to 1, and in the Dutch 23 to 1. This was the situation as the labor regime of first labor regime of global capitalism, slavery, was entering its last century. Shaped by the East India Company's interventions in the 18th and 19th centuries, it marked the early phase of the combined cycle of the exploitation of labor and nature together. Slavery and capitalism came together to reduce labor itself to nature by treating both as disposable. This began a process of forced global labor transfers which remain operational to this day. Reports such as an inquiry into the colonial policy of the European powers by the abolitionist Henry Brougham, published in 1803, provide ample evidence that not only did the first labor regime globalize labor, but it also globalized environmental exploitation alongside it. One of the key case studies is of the Windrush generation that moves between all four labor regimes. The Caribbean as a plantation landscape shaped by the companies and empire was first settled through the use of slave labor, which was replaced by indenture. This created a disposable labor regime where high percentages of labor died during transportation and during their work contracts. The conversion of the Caribbean islands into environmental, as the conversion of Caribbean islands into environmental tourism spaces has renewed their colonization. Out dynamics of migration continued from the Caribbean across the 20th and 21st century, which in the context of the US, of the United Kingdom shaped the Windrush generation. It is the East India Company and British Empire that created the dynamics of impoverishment that has created these generations of low paid, hard-working Caribbean migrants. By the start of the 19th century, opposition to the dehumanizing effects of slavery had made its mark in England so significantly that it began to transition into the second labor regime of capitalism, indenture. This second regime maintained many of the features of the slave system, but replaced the sale purchase deed for workers with indenture contracts. Key features of these contracts included workers not having the right to break their contract, penalties for breach of contract being penal, not civil, and elaborate systems of coercion being built to enforce these indenture contracts. Between 1838 and 1918, around 500,000 South Asians moved to the Caribbean plantations as indentured labor. A total of over 1.6 million South Asian migrants were supposed to have moved under, are estimated to have moved under indenture contracts in this period. Rather than blatant abduction, which had shaped slavery, this indentured regime was more disguised in how it created a cheap globalized labor force. In South Asia, the push factors had to do with the effects of British colonialism across society and economy through the push for highly taxed, export oriented agriculture and the conscious dismantling of traditional industries. The dismantling of these industries disrupted the balance of the relationship between labor and nature within these regions. This was also a regime shaped by companies with the support of European states. The East India Company was at the heart of creating a global regime of cheap labor and cheap nature. Through the globalized exportation of indentured labor, forests were slashed in the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the American South to make way for the plantation. As the plantation itself began to rob the soil of its nutrients, it pushed the need for more indentured labor that could reshape global soil fertility cycles. The discovery of guano, a mix of bird droppings and bones, a highly valuable natural fertilizer, began a global scramble for guano across for the American and Caribbean plantations, which robbed the soils of Latin America. By the 1850s, the US government itself passed a law allowing any US citizen to seize any island containing guano deposits. Workers to undertake the backbreaking work in heat and humidity continued to be brought over through the indentured system. Marx again notes that most Chinese indentured workers brought to extract fertilizer would die just under their 8-year contracts. Similar studies in the Caribbean have noted that around 12% of indentured workers who made it past their perilous journeys over water would die before their contracts were over. As our witness Sudipto has noted, the creation of the plantation created a regime of indentured labor and environmental exploitation, which was built on the backs of extreme violence against labor and nature collectively. The plantation itself, as a combined global labor nature exploitation regime, still continues across large parts of the world, including Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Critical to this, the continued recreation of the dynamics of indenture till today, with old indenture contracts for plantation workers replaced by indebtedness to plantation owners. The second key dynamic for continuing this has been the destabilizing of small to medium holder agriculture in the former colonies. By forcing commercial crop growing through increased taxation, the East India Company created dynamics of crippling rural indebtedness as well as the overexploitation of soils. This rural indebtedness today is key in shaping both hundreds of thousands of farmers' suicide across India and the outmigration of hundreds of millions of former peasants into the global cheap labor regime. It is this second labor regime of indenture that created the unstable political ecologies across the colonies out of necessity to expand production. These unstable political ecologies, even today, continue to expel quote unquote surplus labor, which remains necessary to keep reducing the cost of exploiting nature. These dynamics have continued into the third labor regime of capitalism of the post Second World War, which is what climate scientists have called the Great Acceleration. The Gulf state economies, which had been backed by the British colonial regime to become monarchies, began a petroleum surge, unionized Arab labor, influenced by the surge in socialist Arab nationalism, was considered too great a threat by the petroleum companies that now ran the Gulf, moderated through puppet regimes. So, as Arab labor continued to be replaced through new forms of labor through the import of Asian labor through new kafala contracts that now mirrored the indenture contracts of the late 19th century. The Asian workers came with labor contracts that required them to work in difficult working conditions that tied them to their employers, who were oil companies with joint British and US ownership. Global institutions like the ILO and UN stood and watched as global indenture was reconstituted. The much promised free laborer never quite emerged across the history of capitalism's combined superexploitation of labor and nature. England and Europe, which had lost so much of its working populations to the sheer destructive forces unleashed by the two world wars, now began to import the descendants of the same labor it had displaced since the 16th century onwards. New waves of migrant workers continue to arrive in Europe from landscapes ravaged by war and overexploited by the expansion of the plantation economy. And so new migrant routes were opened. The descendants of slaves and indentured labor from the Caribbean began to move to England, where they faced a hostile and racist context designed to ensure that wages remain low. This is the story of the Windrush generation who moved to escape the ecological destruction of the plantation economies of the Caribbean to rebuild Britain after it had been devastated by World War II, showing again how militarism, agrarian destruction, and global indenture continue to exist in intimate relationships with each other. This leads us to the context that shapes the fourth labor regime under capitalism. The so-called open movement of the post-World War II era had led to too many victories for racialized labor movements. This dynamic is what shapes the current ongoing crackdowns on migrant labor across the world. The fundamental nature of labor as a global migrant regulated through contracts and violence has not changed. The most obvious parallels of indenture remain in play in the modern Gulf states, where millions of South Asian workers work across petrostate economies in heat that continues to get more extreme with global warming. Much like the indentured laborers of the 19th century, millions of workers operate in spaces where unionization can lead to jail and deportation, and thousands return home in body bags after working on flagship projects like NEOM and the Football World Cups. While Asian migrants die every year due to heat in the Gulf, this global labor regime extends to countries like Canada, where even international students have become converted into unpaid, overworked labor that creates and maintains a cheap workforce. Global fossil fuel capitalism continues to require an expanded migrant labor force, which now shapes the oil fields expansion in Alberta, Canada, and the Dakota oil fields in the US, trampling on indigenous territories along the way. Labor practices as the expanded exploitation of nature continues to remain fundamentally rooted in practices of indenture. Through contracts that are tied to employers, temporary work visas, or restrictions to work in quote unquote hard areas. The indenture contract today remains the template for global labor contracts, with the ILO and UN operating as these benign enforcers, apparently combating modern slavery. But their own low estimates put these numbers at around 50 million people. Enthralled to multinational companies and the state, the global labor regime has reinvented the indenture contract in new ways, regulated through the arbitrariness of visa regimes and the threat of violence both inside and outside borders. Slavery and indenture in the plantations in the first and second labor regimes were seamlessly reinvented in the third and fourth labor regimes through coercive contracts, restrictions on labor movement, and a rising anti-immigrant worker sentiment, which works together to ensure the joint exploitation of labor and nature continues today. In Europe and North America, the tightening of migration regimes have instilled terror across millions of workers within ever-changing legal regimes. The rapid rise of the far right in the global north constitutes a new project to unleash global labor and nature exploitation with renewed vigor. The global ecological crisis will only be made worse by the expansion of the exploitation of labor that these new regimes will create. Labor must remain mobile, but it must not be free, remains the principle that has underpinned global capitalism since the heyday of the East India Company. The East India Company also created the template for the multinational company, which destroys ecologies and manages the global import and export of cheap labor. This includes a range of companies, including Tesco and its reliance on cheap labor imports from North Africa in the plastic landscape of Andalusia, or Canadian oil extraction companies in Alberta that devastate centuries-old forests to replace it with polluted landscapes that rely on temporary migrant labor. As global companies collaborate with authoritarian governments to maintain cheap global labor, the stories of mobile labor have become even more precarious due to climate change. It was ships that transported slave and indentured labor. It is still ships that transport the quote unquote undocumented migrant labor across seas and oceans today. The journeys of labor themselves, whether through seas, mountains, deserts, themselves involve fighting nature itself for their survival. Today, the same journeys take place across rougher terrains impacted by climate and environmental change brought about by the fundamental imbalance created in the labor and nature relationship by the East India's Company's involvement in the development of global capitalism. Respected judges, the history of globalized labor charges the East India Company with intergenerational climate crimes. I rest my argument and open the floor to questions.
We do apologize for any sound issues which has complicated the reception of the evidence even more. But I just thought for the benefit of people who may have missed some parts of the evidence, I will just summarize very briefly what Comrade Hashim has told us. I think in summary, he said that there were, so far, beginning with the East India Company, we have had 4 labor regimes. East India Company started this practice of labor mobility, but no labor freedom. Yeah, so that, and each regime has built on the previous one. So the second one built on the first one, the third one on the first and second, and the present one on the whole. So there is a continuity in that. Each labor regime has, destroyed, has 3 characteristics. One is penalty for breach of contract, and the penalty is penal, that is criminalizing breach of contract, and it's not a civil breach of contract. The inability to break the contract on part of the worker, which keeps them in bondage, and the creation of an elaborate system of coercion and violence. So these 3 attributes are common through all the 4 labor regimes. And then he told us about each labor regime being constructed with the support of states, but always in favor of corporations. Because who is the labor for? And that was a critical question. So it was for the plantations and the planters in the East India Company days. It was for the rebuilding national economies after World War II in these countries. And then there was the kafala system, which was for oil corporations and the services that come. And we saw that it's Tesco and companies like that. And he also mentioned that each labor regime, and he mentioned that the indentured labor contract remains the main template for global labor contracts that are promoted by ILO and other development organizations of the United Nations. That is in the fourth labor regime that we have today. And in each regime, both nature and labor were affected because people either fled from the collapse of their agrarian economies at home or the plantation economies where they were already taken as enslaved labor, or other forms of ecological destruction that came with fossil fuel extraction and with the supply chain economies. So those were kind of broadly the connections he made, that the corporations and states benefited both from exploitation of people and of nature. So that was basically the summary. I'm sorry if I've not captured everything that was said, Hashim. I hope I have summarized you correctly, but I think that was the summary of it.
D'Souza, thank you, Judge D'Souza. Thank you for this summary, which is critical, as in a moment we will be asking you as members of the public jury to vote on the findings of this special court. We can imagine that there are still questions in relationship to the evidentiary testimony of our advocate that you would like clarifications for. So those of you who have a question for the advocate, please raise your hand, limit your questions to 1 minute, and Presiding Judge D'Souza will call the questions out.
Yes, here. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess the question was about kind of transnational coalition building around unions, and if maybe you could just expand on the role of unions that kind of were created around indentured workers in these like various diasporas that you mentioned, and kind of like what state response was to unions. So I'm thinking mainly about like places like Kenya and Guyana, but anywhere really as an example. Cheers. Should I give you this one?
I think resistance takes a range of forms in these contexts, right? So unionization is one part of the different stages that takes place. All of these forms of resistance are fundamentally met with violence, but often, I mean, the sentiment itself and the way these communities are able to come together is powerful enough to enact or at least create enough pressure for foundational change. And it really depends on sort of where and which context we're talking about. If you want to go into the sort of deeper history of these efforts, but you see sort of slave revolts starting in 1530 in the Caribbean plantations. And in the U.S. plantations, you have major slave revolts running throughout its history, but majorly, especially in the early 19th century. One of the key things that has certainly happened is in particular when you think about these sort of two globalized diasporas are what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a globalized Asian diaspora and we're talking about a globalized African diaspora. And both of them have created their own sort of ways of of dealing with the international nature of their exploitation within the global labor regime. So Mustafa spoke about the Ghadar Party, which was an effort by sort of South Asian migrants to bring together this global coalition to to sort of seek freedom from both sort of exploitative land, labor, and economic practices of the colonial empire. Uh, in the Pan-Africanist context, it's a sort of too long to list as a sort of law if one were to tell the long story. Uh, but is key to remember that these populations, even in their descendants today, continue to remain aware of these cross cutting tendencies of existing as uh, a byproduct of these long processes of collective exploitation, even though perhaps at sometimes we may feel that the consciousness is and there are obviously clear cut efforts to try and make sure that that consciousness itself doesn't develop. So I'll maybe stop there, but partly maybe I'll just add. I think in particular it is the transition in the sort of 1980s and 90s to the sort of neoliberal regime, which really is designed to sort of dismantle this collective sensibility that the that migrant labor populations have developed and are increasingly becoming more and more vocal uh, in terms of being able to challenge at least their exploitation, if not the foundational exploitation of nature that came alongside the form of work that they were doing.
Yes. Yeah, here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question that links, in a sense, all the cases we've heard so far and then the presentation right now. So I want to start with Judge D'Souza's early comment that these hearings are holding law itself into account. And all the cases thus far have pointed to a collusion between capital, corporations, and the state that very much take place within the frame of the legal. That is, slavery, indenture, etc., all of them were legal. So I wonder if you have either any thoughts or any specific examples to offer that might allow us to hold these systems into account that either push the legal or that actually take place beyond the frame of the legal, but are still systems that hold people and the systems that take place accountable.
I'm curious because it's an interesting question, because in a certain way we are ourselves a part of a process of sort of pushing the boundaries of the legal. And in many ways, I think both within and outside the law, uh, i- is like resistance has kind of always been articulated across these domains, right? So it's the resistance both pushes the boundaries of the law but questions law more foundationally. Uh, I I don't know if I could point to like specific examples off the top of my head. It's certainly something to sort of investigate. Uh, but I would say at least if we see the legal parallels, that the legal parallels themselves are manifold. Uh, i- the indenture contract is replaced by new work visas, and work visas everywhere in the world come with heavy restrictions. I know Mustafa talked in quite detail about like being tied to employers in Canada, something that's sort of critiqued in the context of the Gulf, but that's also true in the context of America. So this foundational bounding of workers to employers and effectively putting them in places where they cannot pushback is a critical space that even in the sort of long evolution of the sort of law in relation to this question and the critique that has come around it it still foundationally maintains some of these key features, because eventually at any critical moment where the critical mass sort of gets too high, we see periods of severe crackdowns on migrant worker organizing. Uh, I mean, even if we go back to sort of the Haymarket and as a sort of foundation of like global Labor Day, uh, it was the discourse being raised in Chicago was against German and Polish migrants and German and Polish migrant workers. So it is quite remarkable how, in periods where sort of labor begins to mobilize and begins to push against the boundaries that are set by law around labor contracts, that we see uh, these major sort of clampdowns happen, and there it is the precarity of the sort of labor contract visa regime that does empower states and corporations quite significantly in trying to break some of the more radical edge of labor around these questions.
Yeah.
Wondering about the connection between mobilizing labor and how that has impacted quote unquote nature and our other than human comrades. We as humans have the ability to speak up, to revolt, to disagree, and sometimes that has some impacts, and often it doesn't. But what about our other than human comrades, and how have we historically seen any benefit or change in the way we treat our ecological systems?
I think I mean, as with most sort of liberal modes of governance, they all pretend to say that we are doing better. I think the evidence that we have presented before the court today uh, is ample enough to suggest that nothing foundationally has changed in the relationship between in how uh, colonial capitalism continues to sort of structure the relationship between nature and labor. And in particular, of course, it opens up the stories of sort of other than human species, right? And in particular, it creates. I mean, there are like critical but also like really like interesting stories that play out, right? So one of the stories that I really find fascinating is in the context of Australia, where soldiers who sort of come back after fighting the world wars start sort of colonizing more land, and suddenly they're faced with the great emu population of Australia. And then you have two emu wars, which the emus actually win. Uh, and so it's this kind of bizarre way in which, even as we kind of like destroy nature in a more sort of this pernicious sort of sense that is sort of everlasting, you kind of have like nature fighting back in really curious and sort of unpredictable ways that sort of capitalist science and capitalist economics cannot predict. I mean, even I know Mustafa spoke about the pandemic, and many have sort of spoken about the pandemic itself as a function of the overextension uh, of human beings into nature and its over destruction. And we are seeing an increase in many ways of, even at the level of like bioorganisms or microorganisms. uh, the destruction of the ecology is producing resistant uh, microorganisms, which whose future, who knows where that will go. But in particular, it is a complex and really interesting space if one starts to sort of open up these stories of what actually happened uh, in these periods of expansion to non-human species, and both the modes in which we sort of destroyed them alongside it, but also how they were themselves not like static actors which were just on the receiving end, but were also able to sort of at least uh, sort of fight back and without necessarily giving them agency in a sort of human way. Yeah.
Any further questions? No? Where? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Thank you, comrade. Given the acronym TWAIL, or Third World Approaches to International Law, and insofar as it has been said that you have collaborated with Via Campesina, who has advocated for the 2018 Universal Declaration of the Rights of Peasants, and furthermore, that there is a colloquialism in this country as English as tea and biscuits, how should we consider the vacuum of wealth from south to north if we were to indeed follow the law of rights of peasants?
I mean, if I were to be, precise, I would say that the declaration itself doesn't necessarily open up the room for reparations or sort of north-south transfers in a foundational way. Uh, there is a demand that has been made by both sort of La Via Campesina, but also sort of key parts of the global sort of anti-debt movement as well as the global labor movement. Is a fundamental challenge in sort of ongoing negotiations around, in particular, which have been emboldened around the sort of climate finance question. Uh, the tricky problem always remains that the key countries who are responsible and the key corporations who have sort of aided them, so maybe like in the context of the US, the United Fruit Company, in the context of the UK, the East India Company, and sort of its sort of long-standing antecedents in British oil corporations are simply not willing to take on any reparative or debt forgiveness framework. Uh, and what we need, if we really think about this, it's not just a case of like saying these simple words like debt forgiveness, reparations. Uh, I believe it was Ruth that asked the question in the last session. About needing a fundamentally sort of different approach, and in many ways it is about like disentangling and delinking these relationships in a fundamental way. um, I would certainly think, I mean, a lot of these seem like fanciful ideas, but at some point, like the G20 is able to come together or Davos is able to come together. So why can all sort of countries that export labor not come together? Why can't uh, sort of anti-debt uh, peasant movements and labor movements and all indebted countries come together to form a coalition that does foundationally uh, try to shake up the global order in terms of how it structures finance, labor relations, agrarian like food transfers, and so on. Uh, and I do think all of these connect to each other, and that's why I think the overall case is built around the labor, agriculture, and militarism questions. Uh, and it foundationally sort of ties together the at least three key pillars through which the sort of global super exploitation continues to take place. So I hope that kind of captures the answer. There is certainly more to say on it.
Thank you so much, Comrade bin Rashid, for your expert evidence and for your patience with the court and our technical challenges. This ends questioning.
Well, it is decision time now. But before we do that, I will invite the judges to ask if they want to address the jury and to share their thoughts with them.
I have been taken by the image of a world where migrant labor is all over, and that is a condition of maintaining populations in a state of peremptory transit of everything, no? Transit between their lives and their destiny, no? So I thought of invoking just very shortly a novel by a man called Mitra. This book is called the Ship of Death, and it's the story of people that are trapped without papers inside a ship where they have to work totally without any rights, any possibilities of having any rights, and they cannot really even get out of the boat, get out of the ship, because they don't have papers. They don't have legal papers, passports, etc., to descend on any port where they are. No? These are not only fantasies of this author, but it has happened. It happens in kind of phantom ships in some parts of Asia mostly, but also in the Caribbean and South America. And it's a terrible way of depicting the human condition of this, let's say, capitalism of the 21st century. No? So again, as I was asking Mostafa, what do you find as a possibility? What do you find as a way of looking at everything we have said and trying to understand ways out?
Thank you very much. I have to apologize. I didn't hear most of the last speaker. It was very how do you call it, muddled at this end of the stage here. Actually, what was happening is that we were getting the person speaking was actually about 2 minutes or a minute after they said something over here. We're getting the same thing. Anyway, I so anyway, I just want to make a comment about. So initially, yesterday we heard about the East India Company and the growing of indigo and other crops, creating a indentured families that were continued intergenerationally. Then today we heard that the dissolution of the East Indian Company and the assumption of control by the British Crown, in fact, continued a process where they stepped out from behind the company. They created the company originally in 1600s to shield themselves against liability, but then stepped out from behind that company, the face of the company, and assumed a more public face and started doing things that put in place laws that gave legitimacy to what they were doing. And, you know, this having legislation about quote unquote legal immigration for people to travel in using the concept of that they are legally allowed to travel, that they legally have rights to travel, they're legally allowed to go into other territories for education or for purposes that have a distinct process. Because if you look at what we're doing today, trading with people's lives in East India Company, the British Crown, and the violent severance of land and people relationship, what has happening or is still happening is that people think that our country, now called Canada, is a free place. Like anybody can come there if they have the right paper. But they don't ask us if it's okay to come there. And when they come there, they come and they abuse us. And they abuse our lands. They abuse our water. They abuse our children. So the intergenerational component of what's happening here with these companies and the outward or inward migration into our territories is actually continuing the violence that was perpetrated someplace else and now it's being brought into our territory. So the East India Company, originally what it was designed to do, continues to do the concept of the company, and the governments are using that concept of trying to hide behind corporations. When we were having a little break, I said to my fellow judge here, I wonder what these people are told when they're coming to fill out those forms. What are you going to be doing in that country that you're going to? You're going to take a job, but why are you doing that job? You know, in our territory, we don't have running water in a lot of our places. We don't have indoor plumbing. We don't have electricity. We don't have roads. But, you know, people think Canada is a first world country and everybody has that same right, but they don't look behind the screen. And now Canada now has stepped behind the screen that was originally designed in 1600 to shield them from scrutiny. So the violence continues, but people don't see that, and they need to see that. So thank you.
People need to see the violence. Thank you for that, for reminding us of that. But I'll just say a few words just to draw your attention, bring your attention back to the decision making. What we have talked about today is the relationship of land and people. And this relationship is a two-way street. You take people off the land forcibly, and they don't have a ground to stand on, literally, and they become vulnerable. And when they become vulnerable, that is what allows corporations to use them and throw more people out of the land in other places. So long as people were looking after their own land, the land was fine. But when you have another person that we call the legal person who takes over the land, then we find that the land is in trouble, in serious trouble. Yeah? And we heard about the kafala system, where people are taken as indentured labor to work there, but to work to do what? What kind of work? To work for the legal persons, the corporations, to extract oil. So that you can see that the destruction of nature and the destruction of people goes hand in hand. Likewise, we heard about Tesco, yeah, and many of us rely on Tesco for our food shopping, and the intensive exploitation of land. It destroys the land and it destroys the people. So this is the connection that the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes is trying to re-establish and get us to rethink that it is not about exploitation of land alone or exploitation of people alone, but it is a relationship. And if this relationship is not healed, then neither land is healed nor people are healed. So this is what we are called on to think. And this today's hearing very clearly shows whether it is the East India Company deforesting Assam and the animals that lived in the forests, etc., becoming an enemy instead of co-living as they were before, or whether it is the kafala system, or whether it is plantation labor. Land and people are inseparable relationships, and we need to think about how we can think of them as a relationship and not as objects. And the legal system that we live in invites us to think of them as property and as wage labor, which both you can sell in the markets. And that is what we have tried to, the stories that we have heard so far has told us. So with that kind of thoughts, I will just invite you to put the questions.
We move to the verdict by the public jury, and the Special Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes puts before you two questions, which we will ask you to respond to one after the other. You will have the possibility to vote either agree or disagree. So I now call on public jury members to vote on the first question put to you by this court. And I will repeat the question twice. Based on the evidence that you have heard, do you agree that the indentured labor system introduced by the British East India Company jointly with the British Crown established a system of legalized slavery in South Asia that separated people from their lands and subjugated them to indebtedness, poverty, and ecological crisis? I repeat the question. Do you agree that the indentured labor system introduced by the British East India Company, jointly with the British Crown, established a system of legalized slavery in South Asia that separated people from their lands and subjugated them to indebtedness, poverty, and ecological crisis? Those who agree, please raise your hand and hold your hands up until the end of the vote count. Thank you. Those who disagree, please raise your hands. Thank you. I now call on the public jury members to vote on the second question put to you by this court. I'll again repeat it twice. The question is, do you agree that the transnational corporations and a syndicate of wealthy states have expanded and embedded systems that forcibly tear people from their lands and homelands, subjecting nature and people to precarious lives, forced migrations, and poverty over multiple generations? So the question is, do you agree that transnational corporations and a syndicate of wealthy states have expanded and embedded systems that forcibly tear people from their lands and homelands, subjecting nature and people to precarious lives, forced migrations, and poverty over multiple generations? Those who agree, please raise your hand and hold your hand up until the end of the count. Thank you. Those who disagree, please raise your hands. So I am again counting the people who have neither voted for nor against. So in the sense of the votes are overwhelmingly clear, but
Thank you, everyone, for your participation and for helping us to conduct these proceedings and to take your views on board as part of the decision-making process. This hearing is now closed. I want to thank all of you, thank the judges, thank our court clerk for their work, and we will be in touch with you soon.
this concludes today's session, the third and final of these hearings. All video proceedings will be released in the coming month, and the court aims to publish the full verdict in due course. With the closing of these formal procedures, my function as a clerk of this court ends, and I hope you allow me to say a few final words as the co-founder, together with Rade de Souza, of the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. First, I speak on behalf of both of us when I express my extreme gratitude to all of our advocates and witnesses, whether they were able to be physically present with us or not. We thank you for your trust, and we thank you for your truths. Mostafa, Sudipto, Ghulam, Roof, Leonida, Hashim, Andy, Swati, and James. To me, listening to you these past days, it made me realize even more profoundly that what the People's Court, or in our case, what a more than human tribunal is really about. It's about truth-telling. It's about regrounding ourselves in common truths at a time of exterminative lies. The lies that are told right in our face when they say that there is no genocide happening right in front of our eyes. Even though we all see the mass extermination of our Palestinian comrades, sisters, and brothers happening right in front of our eyes. Even though we all see the extermination of people and their natures, the extermination of their rivers and their seas right in front of our eyes. Regrounding common truths in these times of exterminative lies is in itself a profoundly important political act. And thanks to all of your work, you testified and brought into evidence the genocidal and ecocidal reality of the British East India Company, an organization that we know now may have been formally dissolved, but is very much still in existence, and we all see its ongoing devastating consequences. This thanks, of course, also extends to our comrade Indigo, who indeed has began propagating its seeds, literally throwing its seed pods all around the court floor at the beginning of this session, and in the meantime has sprouted new leaves. And we take Comrade Indigo's public act of propagation as an act of solidarity in our own attempt to propagate this alternative legal framework that we have all collectively been carrying together these last days. Putting the law on trial means we try to separate ourselves from the institutions as we know them. It means to recognize that a law that enables mass extermination, a law that makes profit from genocide and ecocide, is itself a crime. This is why we put the law on trial. And to do so, we are required guidance. It is a traumatic act to fully dislocate ourselves from institutions that we so often somewhere still hope will or might speak in our name, even though the social contract they supposedly represent has been broken time and betrayed time and again. This guidance comes from people who have been on the front lines of struggle for self-determination. Our judges, Sharon and Ramon, you have been these guides these last 2 days alongside Rada throughout these proceedings. When you spoke from the depths of lived experience. You spoke with generosity that comes from lives lived and lives fought in deep solidarity. So we thank you for all that you are and for all that you do. Grounding common truths also needs organizations willing to create transformative spaces. Emma, Mary, Jessica, Damien, Josine, Cas, Roshini, Neil, Matthias, Hans, certainly Lucia. You are the people within cultural and educational organizations pushing them beyond what they were ever meant to be And without you, the truths we need would not find the spaces of resonance required to hear them. So thank you. And thank you to our teams, Daisy, Isabel, Eva, Daniel, Mohammed, Nadine, Paul, Remco, Ruben, Michael, Niklas, Ruben, Daniel, Kar, Cerise, Matthew, Steve, Guinevere, Abdul, Antoni, Blessing, Charlene, Eli, Elijah, Francisca, Ilias, Julia, Carla, Sana. Without all of your work, the ecosystem that holds this court together, none of this would have happened in the first place. To you, members of the public jury, some of you who have witnessed alongside of us, tried to search for common truths throughout 3 days, yesterday, 8 hours of hearing. Institutions only exist when we collectively provide them legitimacy. And the courts that allow fossil capitalism to burn our living worlds for the private profits of elites, these courts are of course nothing but theaters. They are in the end just architectural spaces adorned with design symbols, adorned with artworks that provide them symbols of power and legitimacy. The law is just a script, and judges, lawyers, and prosecutors are actors. But that does not mean that their performance does not constitute actual material reality, the kind of reality that made it impossible for Comrade bin Rashid to be here because we were not able to protect, to guarantee his physical safety. So that means, but it does mean that when we collectively decide that these theaters no longer represent us, that we can choose other courts. And by coming here and by testifying alongside of us, by taking your role as members of the public jury, you did this, you carried these truths that we need alongside us, which is an essential part of separating ourselves from these criminal institutions. Finally, to my comrade and collaborator, Rade de Souza, with these hearings, we mark 10 years of comradeship. We met first in the movement before we created the CICC through your writings, your activism, your legal work. In this court, we speak about a law of life. And this concept of the law of life is something that I fundamentally learned from you, but not exactly from you, but actually through your grandmother. She taught you, your grandmother, and your grandmother, through you, taught me that the law of life is constituted by the work of all living beings to create the conditions for themselves and for others to live. And that is what defines earth work. That is what connects us as earth workers across the human and more than human world, across the intergenerations, the multiple generations that we celebrate and honor in this court. As there is a law of life, there are also gifts of life. Sharing paths with you, sharing struggle and imagination with you, sharing friendship and comradeship with you is one of those most precious gifts.
It's a Sunday afternoon and it's a nice day outside. So I don't want to keep you back too long. I will just add to the thanks that Jonas has already said. He mentioned my grandmother, and I passed on what she told me to him. But perhaps it's now also time to remember my grandfather, who used to always say, when you go out and do good things in the world, Mother Nature will always be with you and support you. This is what he always told us all over and over again. And the last 2 days I've been sitting on that chair. When Comrade Indigo was brought into this room, there was not one green leaf on this. But I see this whole sprouting. I've been literally sitting there and watching this green come out. And to me, it's a message. Mother Earth is trying to tell us something. And what she's telling us is sprout green seeds, sprout green leaves, grow, and, and enrich the earth. That is what she's trying, that is the message that we are getting from this. And so with that, I will say just one couple of observations. One is people say this is an art project. This is not a real court. But think about it. For 2 days, all of you were here. You sat through 3.5 hours. We have parents of one of our witnesses who have been here for 2 days, whole days, 2 sessions, right? They are not, they are not activists or academics, but they've sat through that. They have also raised their hands, put their hands to their heart, and affirmed what we are saying. This must be real. It can't be all drama, right? It must be real. And this is also a part of reality, that we come together, we affirm things. And the other thing that my grandfather used to say, when you believe in something, you must continue to uphold it. You must continue to stand for it, never mind who says what. Truth and justice, you should always stand by it, regardless of what. And things will turn around. It is bound to turn around, right? There was some question about inside the law, outside the law, is this the law, and all of those things. How are we putting the law on trial here, and so on. But history is something that has featured in all the 3 hearings very strongly. We had great historians who presented evidence on the East India Company and all of that. But think about it. In 1858, Queen Victoria issued what is called the Queen's Proclamation. In that proclamation, she promised the South Asians non-discrimination, equality before law, and she said, we will respect your laws and your culture and your ways of life. 1858. What did we get? We got state repression, we got Vernacular Press Act, we got Dramatic Performances Act that did not allow us to. The Indigo Rebellion play was a trigger to the Dramatic Performances Act, and so on. And then we got the Ghadar movement. People said, we are not putting up with this. And what was the Ghadar movement's claim? They put the law on trial. They said, you promised all these things, you issued the Queen's Proclamation, and then you're doing the same thing. So, that is also, and did that happen inside the court, outside the court? It happened everywhere. But most of all, it happened in the court of life, where people stood up for truth and for justice. This is what our grandparents who fought the freedom struggle taught us. This is what we are trying to teach the people, younger generations who come after us. And I hope you will then pass it on to the generation that come after you. So, yes, go and green the world and live and support everything that you can and stand for truth and justice.